Brands are releasing new cameras right, left and center, and with social media and all of these influencers flexing and reviewing all of them, there is no question why we feel like shit with the gear we have. And with that said, hi and welcome to this 1 year review of my Sony A7R3, a camera that is by now starting to get a little bit dated. And this video is definitely not going to be technical analysis, but rather just some thoughts and things that I have noticed after using this camera for a year. And it is definitely the best camera that I have ever owned, and I have really enjoyed shooting with it for the past year, but it wasn't really an easy decision to get it in the first place, because it was a quite expensive camera, and before using Sony I was a Canon shooter, so I was using the Canon 80D. But there were kind of two main reasons why I decided to go with the Sony. And the first one being that in our production company we were using the Sony camera systems. So it made a lot of sense to go with the Sony route just for that reason. The second reason for me specifically going with the R3 was that I wanted a photo specific camera, or photo camera specialized for photography. Overall, I'm super happy with the decision to go with the A7R3, and I'm just super stoked on what it delivers, and it just keeps on surprising me for every day I'm using it. And I actually think this is the first camera where I haven't felt the urge since I purchased it to get a new camera, because it has always delivered on the things that I needed to deliver on. But with that out of the way, this isn't a perfect camera in any way. There are a few things that I would like to change about it, or things that I would like that it had or did better. But first of all, let's talk about form factor and the size of the camera. So the Sony A7 series are very small cameras in general, and the Sony A7R3 weighs in at roughly 650 grams. So the camera body is quite small, and one thing that I have noticed is that my little pinky sometimes fall off the bottom of the camera, which can be a little bit annoying. But personally, I don't have that much of a problem with it, since I don't have that big of a hands. But if you do have bigger hands, that might be a little bit of a problem. But you can solve that if you get a battery grip, which extends the camera. So personally, in a way, I am actually a big fan of the small size and the form factor of the camera. It makes it very versatile, so I can bring it pretty much anywhere I go. But that can also be a negative side, because it makes it so that I don't want to bring any of my other cameras, which means that the other cameras I have don't really get used that much, because I only want to bring the R3 because it's the best camera I have, and since it's very small, I always bring it. But overall, a small camera is actually a good thing. Yeah, I have to accept. But when it comes to size, it can also be a bad thing when it comes to client work, because it can actually be worth it to have a kit or a camera and a lot of stuff that makes it look like you have a bigger camera kit, because for a client that can make them feel more comfortable hiring you. And on this topic, I actually have a quite funny story. So when I first got the camera and I brought it to my shoot with a few friends of mine, non-photography friends, and their first reaction was, wow, that's a small camera, are you going to use that? And there you have me standing thinking, I just spent $3,000+ for something that people think is a toy. Yeah, life. So for example, if you do a lot of video work, it could actually be worth it to invest in some kind of kit for your camera, so you can start building it out, so building a rig and getting something like this, where you get a cage, handle, and you can have a display on top. So getting something like this could actually be worth it if you are doing that kind of client work. And the next step would be to use something like some rods, get that follow focus, and maybe a V-mount battery. And that V-mount battery brings me into the next point that I want to talk about on this camera, and that is the battery life of the Sony A7R3. Because personally, I think it's a little bit too bad for what I would like it to be. But I get it, it's a mirrorless camera and they do drain a little bit more battery, but personally I wish it had a little bit of a better battery life. When it comes to photography, I think it's enough, but when it comes to videography, it's a little bit harder because you do drain a bit more of that battery life. So that is definitely something you have to keep in mind. I would recommend getting a few extra batteries when you get the R3 so that you don't run out of battery life. That would suck. That would suck. And the battery life is also one of the reasons why I'm considering getting a V-mount setup for my rig. So let's talk a bit about the image quality. So the A7R3 has a 42.4 megapixel full frame sensor, and by today's standards that is still a great sensor, and the amount of detail you can get from this camera is absolutely amazing. It is totally enough for any kind of printing or publishing work, which is also one of the main reasons why I decided to go with this camera, so that I could do all of my photography work. The amount of detail and high megapixels also allows you to crop a lot in post-production, which is very good for us photographers that might not be as good as some others. So if you are just posting for social media, you can crop a lot in post and nobody would notice. And the low light capabilities I think are absolutely great. I can shoot at the ISO of 6400 almost without seeing any noise or artifact, and sometimes I even boost the ISO up towards 12,000 and it can still work. It gets a little bit more noisy, but it can work for some instances. So I think the low light capabilities of this camera is definitely acceptable. I shoot a lot of sports and cars, and having 10 frames per second when shooting is really good, and autofocus works really well for those high speed photographies as well. But I got the camera mainly for photography purposes, but how does it stand up with video? And that is a great question. So the R3 has S-Log3, but only 8-bit capabilities. So personally I wouldn't use S-Log3 for that 8-bit because the camera can't really handle it. So when I shoot video, I usually shoot with S-Log3, and that works really well as long as you boost the saturation a little bit in the camera, because if you don't and then boost the saturation in your post-production, you can get some artifacts in the colors and so on. So just keep that in mind, and if you know how to use the camera, I do think that it is definitely capable enough for some instances when it comes to videography. It is a camera focused mainly on photography, and therefore it won't be as good at videography as, let's say, the A7S series. So, but with that, let's wrap it up, recap and summarize it by saying that the R3 is definitely a good camera in 2021 and 2022. I definitely think it still stands up to those standards. But when it comes to choosing which camera to get, it all comes down to finding out what your purposes are. So what are you going to need your camera for? Because there isn't going to be one perfect camera, because everyone have different needs. They need to use the camera for different stuff. So in today's landscape, it's not as much as which camera you have, it's more about choosing the right camera for you. And if you enjoyed this video here, you should definitely check this one out here on how to get sharper images, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace out.